The night was cold, and the wind howled through the empty parking lot, carrying with it the distant echoes of something unknown. Beth shivered as she pulled her jacket tighter around herself, her breath coming out in white puffs in the crisp air. She glanced at the Walmart in front of her, its massive sign glowing a dull yellow in the darkness, casting an eerie light over the asphalt. The store was still open, its automatic doors sliding shut and open with an unsettling regularity, like the gaping mouth of some giant beast, waiting to swallow its next victim. Beth had never liked shopping at night, but she had run out of diapers for her baby, and the 24-hour Walmart was her only option. Her husband, John, had offered to go, but he was exhausted after a long day at work, and she didn't want to wake the baby to drive with him. So, she decided to go herself, thinking she'd be in and out in no time. As she walked toward the entrance, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from John, *be safe, love. Come back soon. *, she smiled, typing a quick reply before shoving the phone back into her pocket. The sliding doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and she stepped inside. The store was oddly quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of daytime shoppers replaced by a stillness that set Beth on edge. She grabbed a cart and began walking through the aisles, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering slightly as she moved past rows of products. The place seemed emptier than it should have been, even for this time of night. Beth made her way to the baby section, grabbing a pack of diapers and some formula before heading to the checkout. She noticed a few other shoppers here and there, their faces pale and drawn, but she paid them little mind, focused on getting home as quickly as possible. But as she reached the front of the store, she realized there was no one at the registers. She frowned, glancing around. The registers were all empty, the checkout lanes eerily silent. She waited a moment, expecting someone to appear, but no one did. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. There was no response. Unease settled in her stomach. She walked over to the customer service desk, but it too was abandoned. She could see the employee lockers and break room through a small window behind the counter, but it was dark, and there was no sign of life. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant, muffled whir of the air conditioning. Beth's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. She reached for her phone to call John, but the screen was black. She pressed the power button, but nothing happened. The battery had been nearly full when she left the house. There was no reason for it to be dead now. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The silence was suffocating, the store's emptiness unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the aisles, but there was nothing, no movement, no shadows, nothing. But she could feel it, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, like eyes boring into her from somewhere in the darkness. She started walking, her steps quickening as she headed toward the exit, but when she reached the doors, they didn't open. She waved her hand in front of the sensor, but the glass doors stayed shut. Panic began to bubble up inside her. She pushed against the doors, but they didn't budge. She was trapped. She turned around, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and started running down the main aisle. She had to find another way out, a fire exit or a side door, anything to get out of this place. As she ran past the clothing section, she saw a flash of movement out of the corner of her eye. She skidded to a stop, her heart hammering in her chest, and turned to look. A mannequin stood in the center of the aisle, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans, its blank face staring ahead. Beth could have sworn it had been facing the other direction just a moment ago. She backed away slowly, keeping her eyes on the mannequin. She didn't know why, but it filled her with an irrational sense of dread, as if it might spring to life at any moment. She turned and started running again, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty store. She reached the back of the store, where the emergency exit was located. She pushed against the door, but it too was locked. She slammed her fists against it, screaming for help, but no one answered. The store was completely deserted, and the walls seemed to close in around her, trapping her in a nightmare. Beth's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. She couldn't stay here. She had to get home to her baby, to John. She needed to escape, but every door was locked, and her phone was dead. She was trapped in a place that was slowly driving her mad. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with fear. The sound seemed to be coming from the shadows at the far end of the aisle. She squinted, trying to see through the darkness, but it was too thick, too impenetrable. The growling grew louder, and she realized with a jolt of terror that it was getting closer. She stumbled backward, her hands fumbling for something, anything, to defend herself with. Her fingers brushed against a heavy flashlight on a nearby shelf, and she grabbed it, holding it up like a weapon. The darkness at the end of the aisle seemed to pulse, as if something was moving within it. Beth's breath caught in her throat as she saw a pair of glowing red eyes emerge from the shadows, followed by another and another. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move, frozen in place by terror. The eyes moved closer, and she could make out the vague shape of a figure, a hulking, twisted thing that didn't belong in this world. Its growls grew louder, more menacing, as it approached, its eyes locked onto hers. Beth backed up until she hit the shelves behind her, the items rattling as she bumped into them. The creature stepped into the light, and Beth's blood ran cold. It was massive, its body covered in matted fur that reeked of decay. Its face was twisted into a grotesque snarl, its mouth filled with jagged, yellow teeth. The smell of rot and blood filled the air as it drew nearer, its breath hot and foul. Beth raised the flashlight, her hand trembling, and shined it directly into the creature's eyes. It roared in anger, recoiling slightly, but it didn't stop its advance. Desperation clawed at her insides. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She was going to die in this cursed place. The creature lunged at her, and Beth screamed, swinging the flashlight with all her strength. It connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a furious howl. But it didn't stop. It kept coming, its claws slashing through the air as it closed in on her. Beth dodged to the side, barely avoiding its grasp, and started running again, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know where she was going. She just had to get away from that thing, away from the nightmare that had become her reality. She ran past the electronics section, the TVs all flickering with static, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sound of the creature's growls echoed through the store, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. It was toying with her, driving her deeper into the labyrinth of aisles, closer to whatever fate awaited her. Beth's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let that thing catch her. She turned a corner, her foot slipping on the slick tile, and she crashed to the ground, the flashlight skittering away from her. She scrambled to her feet, but before she could take another step, the creature was on her. It slammed into her, knocking her to the ground with a force that drove the air from her lungs. Beth tried to scream, but all that came out was a choked sob. The creature loomed over her, its red eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It snarled, its hot breath washing over her as it bared its teeth. Beth closed her eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of tearing into her, the creature paused, its head snapping to the side as if it had heard something. It growled low in its throat, its eyes narrowing. Then, with a final, hate-filled glance at Beth, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her trembling and gasping for breath. She didn't know how long she lay there, too terrified to move, but eventually, the sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her daze. She looked up, expecting to see the creature returning to finish the job, but instead, she saw a figure standing over her. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face partially hidden by the shadows. His eyes were cold, devoid of any warmth or humanity. He reached down and grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet with a strength that belied his thin frame. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "This place isn't safe." Beth opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was too shaken, too terrified to think clearly. The man's grip on her arm tightened, and he started pulling her through the store, his pace brisk and determined. "We have to leave," he said, glancing around as if expecting something to jump out at them at any moment. "It's not safe." Beth stumbled after him, her mind reeling. Who was this man? What was that thing that had attacked her? And how was she going to get out of this nightmare? The man led her to a side door, one she hadn't noticed before. He pulled out a key and unlocked it, pushing it open with a creak. The cold night air rushed in, and Beth felt a wave of relief wash over her. She was getting out. She was going to survive. But as they stepped outside, the man stopped, his eyes narrowing as he looked at something in the distance. Beth followed his gaze and saw a group of people standing at the far end of the parking lot, their faces hidden in the shadows. "Who are they?" Beth whispered, fear tightening her chest once more. The man didn't answer. He just started walking toward them, his grip on her arm unyielding. Beth hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to run the other way, but the man's hold was too strong. She had no choice but to follow. As they got closer, Beth could see the people more clearly. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes empty and hollow. They stared at her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. "We have to go," the man said again, but this time his voice was different, tinged with something that made Beth's skin crawl. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she noticed the slight smirk on his lips, the glint of malice in his eyes. Fear surged through her, and she yanked her arm free, stumbling back. The man's expression didn't change. He just stood there, watching her with that same cold smile. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice soft, almost mocking. "There's nowhere to run." "Not from them." Beth's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to run, but the group of people was already closing in on her, their eyes locked onto her with a predatory gaze. She backed away, her mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped between the man and the group, and the cold night air seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with its icy grip. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on the curb, and she fell to the ground. The group advanced on her, their faces twisted into cruel smiles. The man's laughter echoed in the darkness, sending a shiver down her spine. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing in her ears. "This is their territory. And now, you belong to them." Beth screamed, but it was swallowed by the night, drowned out by the wind and the man's cruel laughter. The group was on her, their hands cold and clammy as they grabbed her, pulling her to her feet. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but they were too strong. Their grip tightened, and she felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, let me go. I have a baby I have to get home." The man's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a twisted pleasure. "Oh, you'll get home," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But not the way you think." Beth's screams echoed through the night as the group dragged her into the shadows, their faces cold and unfeeling. The last thing she saw was the Walmart sign, glowing faintly in the distance, before the darkness swallowed her whole. And then, there was nothing.